on tape, just in case someone who doesn't know you happens to look at this, and then we'll go right into the interview.
So I don't have to say a sentence, I'll just say my name.
Just say your name on camera and your title, and go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Just say,
Okay, my name is Madeline Anderson.
And you're a producer for Sesame Street.
I own a production company, and I am the executive producer of that company.
Perfect. Wonderful. Okay, commence with the interview.
Okay. How and when did your family come to Lancaster?
I'm not quite sure of the year, but I know that my parents were in their 20s when they moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I know that my father came from North Carolina, and my mother came from Virginia. I know that my mother was born in 1903, and my father was born in 1906. My mother came here to join her two older brothers who were here, Buck Williams and Wesley Williams. They were her older brothers. And then I don't know how my father came here. And he never talked too much about North Carolina. But I do remember seeing a picture of his mother, and she was a very dark-skinned woman with her hair parted in the middle and two braids on the side. And later on in life, I'm an amateur historian, I found out that the Lumbar Indians lived in North Carolina. So I was just always wondering if his mother had been a Lumbar Indian, because the Lumbar Indians intermarried with the African Americans in that period.
Where did you live in Lancaster?
I was born in my Uncle Buck's house at 414 Mercer Avenue. And then I spent a great deal of my childhood until I was in junior high. We lived in the poorest section of the town. It was called Barney Google's Row. Barney Google's Row because there were 10 row houses. The houses were 3 rooms, 3 and 4 room houses, 1 floor. And the man who owned it owned a grocery store. And he looked like the comic strip Barney Google. He had large glasses and he was a short man. So everybody called it Barney Google's Row. What his name was, because everybody called him Barney Google.
With a googly eye. Where else did you live?
When I was in junior high, I lived at a house at the bottom of a hill, and the section was called Lampowder's Row. Lampowder's Row had only 3 houses, 1 large, beautiful house, and 2 smaller houses, but the houses were much better than the house in Barney Google's Row. And we lived in that house only 1 year. Then when I went to high school, we moved to Christian Street. And that was the first really decent housing that I lived in during my childhood in Lancaster.
Who were your neighbors?
My neighbors in Barney Google's Row, there were 10 houses, and most of the people who lived in Barney Google's Row were black. There were white families that came there, but they were transient. They came there and they could do better, and they moved. But the black families stayed there because that was the best that they could do. There were 3 senior citizens there. There were 3 families that had children. There were 5 children in my family. Uh, so I had plenty of playmates. And although Barney's Google's Row was, um, the people that lived there were not quite acceptable. Um, I think because we were poor, but I also, the housing, the very location of our houses defined us. And do you know that I came back to Lancaster after I had accomplished many firsts in the media industry, and someone said to me, "Oh yeah, you lived on Barney Google's Road," so I can tell you how we were defined by where we lived.
Who were your friends?
I had different friends at various times. Uh, when I went to high school, I think is when I had the most friends because I lived on Christian Street. And so I was in a geographical area where most of the young people that I knew who were high school age, they lived in that area. The 2 Wilson girls, Dorothy Wilson and Jean Wilson. Dorothy was my peer. She was in my graduating class at McCaskey, and Jean was her younger sister. So we were like the 3 Musketeers. We had a lot of fun together when I was growing up, especially high school days. Um,
What sort of things did you do together?
well, my parents didn't go to church much. I used to go to church with Dorothy and Jean. They went to Bethel Church on Strawberry Street. Of course, we went to parties. Not in Lancaster. We used to go to Columbia. We Dorothy always found a boyfriend that had a car, and and that's how she met James. James, because the Columbia boys used to come to Lancaster, and so did the Coatesville boys, and so it's friction between the Columbia boys, the Coatesville boys, and the Lancaster boys, right? And somehow the girls always found the Coatesville boys were the best looking. And so there was a lot of friction between those groups. We went to parties, we went to dances, um, picnics. One, one thing that we did was that in Columbia, we could get into clubs. It was a club there that we could get into, although we were underage, and so Columbia was like our favorite place to go.
Was it the Legion in Columbia? Was it the Legion? Or was it a private club?
Was it?
The Legion, or was it the?
It was the Legion. Yes, it was the Legion, exactly. It was the Legion.
What schools did you attend?
My first, in elementary school, I went to a school which was called the Rockland Street School, and then it changed. The name was changed into Higbee. So I went there for the elementary school. Then I went to George Washington, and then that name was changed to Jefferson. And then I graduated from high school, which was McCaskey High School. McCaskey High School was relatively new. I don't even know if it was, we were in the first graduating class in 1945. But it was a new high school. And the facilities were great, the teachers were great. I always had great teachers, really great and caring teachers. I remember once when I was in the 2nd grade, I was sick. And I missed school for a week, and my 2nd grade teacher came to our house to find out, what was going on and why I didn't attend school.
Did you have a favorite teacher?
I had favorite teachers, and one of my favorite teachers in junior high was my French teacher. His name was Mr. Ashley. And you could not come into his, you did not, couldn't speak English. As soon as you crossed the threshold, you became French. You can, and if you spoke English, he threw you out of class. You had to speak French. That was my French teacher. In high school, I had a teacher whose name was a math teacher whose name was Mr. Buckwalder. He was a very, very strict teacher, and he was. They used to call him the grim one because he never smiled. But one day, Mr. Ashley, who was an epileptic, we didn't know that, but he had a convulsion. And of course, we were terrified. We were didn't know what to do. And I went up to the front of the class. I wasn't going to touch him or anything, but I was just standing there, petrified, I guess. And one of my classmates came up front, and I said, "Run and get the principal." So I was given the credit, which it was not really a, a reward for being the hero of that situation. But I wasn't. I was petrified. I was just standing there.
Let's go back to the neighborhood. What businesses or stores were nearby, where you lived?
You mean in my early childhood?
Early childhood.
And what was the question?
What businesses or stores were nearby, where you buy food or?
All right, everybody went to the corner store. This is the way Barney Google Road was situated. It was, the main street was Duke Street. Duke Street ran that way. We lived in back of Duke Street. And in the front of Duke Street, I guess you would call them blue class workers. They were all white. They lived there. In the back, the black people lived in the back, which was Barney Google's row. The place where we went to shop was mostly in Barney Google row, in Barney Google's store. He let people buy there on credit. And that's why most of the people who lived on the row shopped there, because they could get credit. We were fortunate, though, when we lived in Barney Google Road, because there was a plot of ground before you got to the houses, and we were permitted to have gardens. So we grew a lot of our food there, especially vegetables. And my mother knew how to can, and my father knew how to hunt. So we always ate pretty well. We had fruits and vegetables and meat. Not the meat wasn't as desirable as he hunted for pheasants, which were not that was delicious. Rabbits, possums. And once a year, the men, my Uncle Buck, my Uncle Wes, my father, and maybe about 6 men, they would go hunting. They would hunt for bear and deer. So we had venison and we had bear meat, which was horrible. And we didn't look forward to that. But my mother knew how to smoke meat. So she used to smoke meat, and we had like meat during the winter. When we lived in Barney Google's Road, the houses were built up. They were sort of elevated up for some reason, I don't know why. And we had a storage underneath, storage space. And so that's where we used to store the potatoes and the meat and things that were perishable. And that's what that. And not everybody hated to go to the storage place because it was a dark, dark place, no lights. And my mother would would, um, we would take chances. She would say odd or even. So if you got the wrong one, you had to go to the storage room.
What about when you moved further into town? Where would you go to the store then?
Okay, now as we moved, our circumstances improved and we got ice boxes. And see, was um, each move moved us higher into better class of living. I guess my father was getting raises. My mother was a domestic, and I remember that during the war, she worked in a factory. So she was capable. All of these women who were domestics were working in factories very briefly, like in the last years of the First World War. They all worked in factories for about a year. And then when the men came home, of course, they went back to working as domestics.
Did your father serve in World War One?
No, my father, he didn't. But he worked in a stone quarry all of his life. And he started out as just a laborer, but as he grew older and I guess more skilled, he became sort of a skilled worker there. And I guess when we moved, it was for better economic circumstances.
What about school activities? After school, were you involved in sports or clubs?
After school, I was always working. From when I was 12 years old, I started to work because I had this ambition. I wanted to go to college. I knew that my parents could not send me to college. And so I was smart enough to know that I had to work. So I started working I had a friend, the Ovids. The Ovids lived on Lampowders Row. They were very strict with their children. The children were not permitted to associate with the people in the 7th Ward. They were religious, and but the only time that we saw the Ovid girls was in school. The oldest daughter, Dorothy, was my peer, and she had her mother had a friend who was a cook in a house on Shippen Street. And we used to go by there to visit this friend after school. And the friend was, we called her Aunt Phyllis. Everybody used to call everybody Aunt and Uncle those days. So Aunt Phyllis knew of my ambition, and she hired me. She said, come in. The people that she worked with, I guess, were wealthy by our standards at that time, and they had parties, and I think they were Jewish. And when they had parties, there was extra work for her for cleaning up the kitchen. So she hired me to come in to help clean up the kitchen. That's my first job at 12 years old. Now I got known in those circles because I was a good worker, so that other people who were cooks hired me. I know there was a family who owned a dry goods store, the Slotkins. The store was on Duke and I forget the other name of the street.
Lucas.
Yeah, Duke. It was a corner store. Well, they hired me to come in and work for holidays. Then there was another family. These families were all Jewish families. They all hired extra work for the holidays or whatnot. They all had children who were in college and that's where I worked in those early years. Now, later, I was known in the neighborhood as a girl who wanted to go to school. I don't know. how that information got transmitted, but people were interested in helping me. There were two men, Mr. George Nolly and Mr. Jim Hurdle. They were in the dry cleaning business. They worked for dry cleaners. They were Mr. Nolly and Mr. Hurdle both taught me how to press clothes. And if I was paid by the piece. If I could press a lot of pieces, get a little nervous here. I would make more money. The more work I did, the more money I made. And that's where I made most of my money, pressing, after I got older, pressing clothes. For Mr. Nolly worked for a company and Mr. Hurdle, but later Mr. Nolly started his own business, and he hired me to work for him, and that's how I made most of my money to go to school.
Now, in terms of going to college, how did you choose the college that you went to?
I was recommended by some of my teachers in McCaskey, and they gave me some money, some scholarship money, and then I had some money, and I went there. I was only the second black person who was ever permitted to go to Millersville at that time. There was one African American person there, a female. Her last name was Waters, and they lived in Columbia. I had good grades, and I did well in school, but I was not welcome at Millersville. Later on, first I just put it down to simple racism. But, I'm a black skin. The Waters girl who went there was very light skinned. She had straight hair, and of course my hair, you can see, is not straight. And there was prejudice against me. I think it was because I was black and everybody else was not black. I was bullied by the male population. They called me names, and I was afraid to go back. I was commuting back and forth. I got on the bus, and I went to Millersville every day. And the faculty knew it because I told them, and they knew what was going on. I had a few white female friends there from McCaskey High School, and they were very kind, and they weren't afraid. But one day, one of the boys threw something. It wasn't a rock or anything, but I was afraid. And so I told my father, and he said, okay, I'm going to go to school with you. So he got on the bus, and he came to school with me. And he did that a few times. I finished the first year. One of the professors on the faculty advised me not to come back. He said, don't come back. I will help you go to Tuskegee, which was a black, predominantly black school. Well, it was all black at that time. But I decided that I was not going to stay in Lancaster, that I was going to leave Lancaster. I wanted to be a filmmaker, which everybody thought was ridiculous for me to want to become a filmmaker. But I wanted to be a filmmaker.
What made you decide to be a filmmaker?
I used to go to the movies. That was one of the big pleasures of my life. Every Saturday morning, we went to the Fulton. There were two theaters, Fulton and Hamilton. Hamilton was not very friendly. The Fulton, they let us come in. So what we would do, we would take our lunch. My mother always gave us an apple and two Mary Janes. Mary Jane little pieces of candy. That was our lunch. We would go to the movies, and we saw Tarzan and the Apes, Flash Gordon, Gene Autry. But I was, at that age, I was so disappointed in the black people. They were so stupid. Here they were, these people who owned the country. They were the kings, but the white man always came in and gave them a few beads or something and took everything. And I thought, black people aren't that stupid. Come on now. Come on now. So this is what I thought in my young mind. I'm going to teach black people that we're achievers, because at that time there were doctors who were discovering open heart surgery, Dr. Drew. Okay, there was Madeline Anderson. We were people who were achievers. We were worth something. We weren't these African, just these Africans. So I said, the reason why we behave this way is because we don't know better. I'm going to teach people that we know better. So that was why, and everybody knew that. I was always telling people things that sometimes they weren't interested, didn't want to hear, and said, oh, what's the difference, some of that. But I was always, when I learned something, I was always telling somebody something. And that's why everybody thought I should go to school and become a teacher, because I was always teaching everybody everything. And then I thought, well, they're not very that interested, but what if I made a movie? I bet they would be interested in a movie. So I said, okay, I'm going to become a filmmaker. I'm going to teach people, but through film. There wasn't any television. We didn't have a television set at that time. The only thing we had was a radio. And we used to listen to the Green Hornet and the Shadow. And one person on Barney Google's Row had a radio. And we used to all go there every Sunday and listen to the serials. So that's when, from a young age, I wanted to become a filmmaker.
What were the stories in the community during your youth that really influenced you? What events happened? Was there something that stood out? When we lived on Barney Google's Row, and I was like a junior, I was not in high school. I was still in elementary school. My father, I don't know how he got this information, but he got this information about Garvey. And he thought he liked what Garvey was talking about, that we should all go back to Africa. That was one of the big things that I knew. I didn't even know that we were from Africa until my father got interested in Garvey. And that was a big thing. Were there others who were interested in Garvey also? Were there others in the community who were interested in Garvey, or just your father?
Just my father. He was interested in Garvey. I have no idea why, but he was. And that, as I said, I like to find out things, facts. When I was a kid, I used to walk from Barney Google's Row downtown
and get newspapers out of the waste paper cans. That was my source of information. And then I used to go to the library on, I think it was on Fulton Street. Is there a library there now?
The library now is on Duke Street, but that didn't open until well.
No,
after
Duke.
that.
No, it was Duke Street. It was Duke Street. I used to go there. Everybody knew me there. I used to go there, and one thing that I did, which was very important in my life, I read every book in the children's section of the library. And I thought that was a big accomplishment for me. Now, this is what happened. If you will go back and look in the newspapers, there was an award given to a child who read every book in the children's section of the library. I was one of those children. In the newspapers, there was a picture of a boy who was in my class at Higbee. He was given an award for reading every book in the children's section of the library. Now, the librarian knew full well that I had done that, but nobody else knew that except the librarian and me. But that's what happened.
Did you go to the Crispus Attucks Community Center?
I went to the Crispus Attucks, and that was one of the great places for me to go because the administrator there, her name was Mrs. Bogey. Yes. She was so kind. She taught me so much about behavior, etiquette, achievement, and what it took to achieve. She was so kind and so good. And that was one of my favorite places to go after school, because they had an after-school program, and I used to go there.
Now, obviously Millersville was not the place for you to pursue your educational goals. How did you go to the next step?
This is what happened. I told you I was working, and I knew I had to make more money than I was making pressing clothes. A fortunate thing happened. The Radio Corporation of America, RCA, built a factory in Lancaster County, and they were hiring. At first, they were not hiring black people unless you had a high school diploma. Then you could get a job there. First, I had a high school diploma, and I had 1 year of college. But then they lowered their standards, not so much for black people, but a lot of white people from Lancaster County got jobs at the RCA that didn't have any high school diplomas. They just came off the farm and into RCA. But anyway, I got a job there, and I was making a very good salary for the first time in my life. I was there for a year, and then the international IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, came, and they organized the union, organized the plant, I'm sorry, and they and it became a union shop. I participated in the strike, young idealists, and so when the strike was over, a lot of the people who participated, we got our jobs. I mean, we weren't fired, but it wasn't very pleasant to work there. I had raised enough money, and I thought, well, I have enough. I'm gonna move to New York. My mother had a sister in New York. I lived in Brooklyn, and she agreed to let me come and live with her. I applied to New York University, and they gave me a partial scholarship. And that's what I did. I left New York. I went to live with my aunt. I got a job at Nedick's. Nedick's had a store right across from NYU. I worked at Nedick's, and I went to NYU. Now, I did not graduate from NYU. When I was in my third year at NYU, I got a job working for I was working all the time when I was going to school. I worked in so many jobs, in factories, as waitresses. I was a proofreader. I was always working. And that's how I was able to support myself, because I was always working. And I was working 2 jobs at a time and going to school and getting good grades. And that kept me afloat. This was in the summer. I got this job working as a researcher for a film. And this seemed like this is it. So I took that job, and then I was able to get a job as a babysitter boarder with one of the most famous documentary filmmakers in New York at that time. When I told him and his wife what my ambitions were, they were so supportive. And they said, "Oh, this is a great idea. No one has ever done this before. You know, we're going to support you in going to college, and we're going to help you get into the film industry." And they did.
What was his name, the documentary?
I made my first film working with this, his name is Richard Leacock. And if you talk to anybody that knows anything about film, he was one of the most famous filmmakers, documentary filmmakers in the United States and then in the world as his career developed. He set up, after working with him, as living with them as a babysitter boarder, he set up a production company, and he hired me. He had that much confidence in my abilities, and he hired me. I started out first as a person who was, you would call that person a production manager, and that was ordering equipment, keeping the books, and keeping up with the schedule. I did that. As I did that, I learned the rudiments of filmmaking. I learned what kind of raw stock to use and what cameras. I learned all of the technical parts of it. I was so fortunate. And I worked with a group of filmmakers at that time who were in that same location. And I learned, the one thing that I learned earlier in life is that if you want to do something, you have to learn how to do it. And then you'll be successful. A lot of people don't think that. They know, I want to do this, and then they just go do it. And many times they're not successful. But I learned that early on, that if you want to be successful, you have to learn what you're doing. You have to learn about it. And so I took my time in that first job to learn everything that I could, and I took every course that I could. I went to equipment houses. I went to film libraries. I learned, and I learned, and Ricky Leacock, he had faith in me, and he produced the first film that I made in 1958 called Integration Report 1. Integration Report 1 is about the struggle that black people started in that period. It was just not in New York, it was nationwide. It was after the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956. There were a lot of incidents of police brutality, lousy education, discrimination in housing. That film is still shown today. People are still interested in, they can't believe it. It's like a blueprint for what's happening today. It's uncanny. And so I made that film in 1958. And then after that, I thought I was going to make a lot of films, right? Because now I had a track record. So I had the temerity to go to the networks and talk about ridicule. Here I'm coming, a black woman, trying to get into the industry. There weren't any black people in the industry. So that was my hurdle. It was a catch-22. You couldn't get a job unless you were in the union, but you couldn't get into the union unless you had a job. So, and also, this is how the unions worked at that time. They weren't a guild, but they acted like they were a guild. Many of the unions were like father-son's union. If your father was in the union, then you had a 100% chance of getting into the union yourself. Okay, I'm black, I'm a woman, my father's not in the union. So I knew I was going to have a fight on my hands, and I wasn't alone. I had support from people who were in the union, and so I tried to get into the union. And it was a long, hard struggle. I had to threaten to sue the editors union. That was the union that I chose to get into because it would suit my lifestyle, because in the meantime I was married and I had started my family. And the editors union, you work on a project. It's project by project. You work on a project. When that project is finished, you get another job on another project. So you can have a break, all right? So I thought that's good for me as a woman and as a mother and a wife. So I tried to get into the editors union. Now, at that time, it was in the early 70s. In New York, there was a recession, and people were very protective of their jobs. So I chose a wrong time to try to get into the union. I did all the requirements. I was fortunate enough to get work in the lowest rung of the editors union, which was as an apprentice. I remember the first job I had as an apprentice. What an apprentice does is they take the reels of film and they put them on, put one here, put it on one side, and then they roll it to the other side. I called my mom up. I said, "Mom, I have a job in the editors union." She said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And I told her. She said, "Well, don't they have machines that do that?" Deflate time. Anyway, I had filled all the requirements. You had to work in a place for a year and a half. I did that. Very difficult, very hard to do. and could not have done it unless I had opportunities and people helping me, but I did it. When it came, when I had fulfilled my requirements, I went to the union and I said, yeah, I've done it. They said, oh, well, we're not taking in anybody right now. So I said, well, if you don't hire me, I'm going to sue you. And I went to the National Labor Relations Board. That's what was in effect at that time, the NLRB. And before I could bring suit, they said, okay, you can have an application. So that's how I got into the editors union.
Well, you've obviously kept contacts with the Seventh Ward. What did you like about living in the Seventh Ward, and how has it helped you or formed you in your career?
The Seventh Ward, now even though the people in the Seventh Ward where I lived were very poor, but I remember the whole Seventh Ward as being a very vibrant place. I mean, there were activities, there were parades, there were picnics, there were things, it was vibrant. You know, people did things. Even though we weren't, there were no, well, there was a doctor, we had a dentist, a barber, a beauty salon. We didn't have any teachers in the system at that time. But it was a vibrant community. We did things. So I liked that. I liked the spirit. I didn't like the discrimination. Well, if we went downtown to shop in Woolworths, they had a lunch counter. They did not serve us. We were not served at the lunch counter. If we went to the movies, we had to sit in a certain section. I didn't like that. I joined the NAACP when I was 14. I wasn't supposed to. Mr. Eli Hart was I think he was the leader of the NAACP. And I even went to picket the Brunswick Hotel because the Brunswick Hotel, we couldn't work, they didn't hire us to work there, and we couldn't eat there. And so we picketed, and they agreed to hire 2 people. And they agreed, and those people had jobs there, and I think they stayed there. I think the jobs were steady there. One thing that we tried to do, okay, the Elks had, the Elks from Lancaster and the Elks from Coatesville used to have a big parade and a picnic at Rocky Springs Park every year. I went there one year. I didn't want to go back because it was very rowdy. I mean, people were partying. I mean, it was a big release. I understood that years later. Years later, I understood things because you get perspective when you get older, and then when you get into other situations, you understand some things that happened in your childhood which you thought were not so great, but then you admired those people because of what they were doing. You understood what they were doing and the importance of what they were doing. But when we went to Rocky Springs, people were so exhilarated. They were so happy to be there that some of them behaved very badly. And it was not a place that I would want to go to again. And also, I hated the thing that we couldn't go into the pool. They never let us into the pool. They promised, but they never did. So I didn't like the discrimination, but I liked the spirit of the people in Lancaster. But I knew that I could never do what I wanted to do in Lancaster. So that's why I left.
Who inspires you in your filmmaking? Was there a African-American filmmaker that you looked
No,
up to?
there weren't any African American filmmakers. I'm the first African American woman director to direct a half-hour film in the United States, and my film is in the Smithsonian, labeled as such.
What do you see as the promise of the future? What should young people today be concerned about? What would you, if you were giving advice to them, what would you tell them?
I would give them the same advice that I was given, because I was successful because I took the advice of people who were successful in what they were doing, and the advice was always work hard and learn what you're doing, and you'll be successful. I think a lot of young people today don't have that kind of perspective. Because they have so many options, and they try to take shortcuts, but shortcuts, for the most part, don't work. If you're proficient at what you're doing, you learn how to do it, you're going to be good.
Thank you. Any other questions? Take a break.
Okay. And we are rolling again.
Could you tell us something about the work-life balance for black women in Lancaster and also in New York?
When I was growing up, the availability of work for many African American women at that time was domestic. I remember there was, outside of the domestics, there was one woman who worked at Watt and Shands, and she was the elevator operator. And during my childhood, I think that those are the only women that I knew that worked. They worked as domestics, or as this one woman, at Watt and Shands. Most of the women had children, multiple children, not just one, but 1, 5, 6. I remember Mrs. Dennison had like 27 kids. I'd go to their house with all her kids, and I was just one of the family, and I wasn't the only one that did that. She made all the kids in the neighborhood welcome, and she'd make cookies and Kool-Aid, and we were just treated up with just one more in the family. Mrs. Dennison and her mother, the children's grandmother. So women worked. There were a lot of grandmothers around at that time who took care of the children when the women worked. And then, of course, what happened is because there were multiple children, the older children took care of the younger children. And that's how they balanced work life and home life.
What about daycare? Was there daycare institutions?
There was a daycare center on, I forget what street it was, but it was in the building that the Oddfellows, remember the Oddfellows? It was in that building. I'm the oldest girl in my family, so I took care of my younger siblings. And 2 of my younger siblings used to go to a daycare center in that building. And I used to always time it to go there when the Graham cookies and milk was passed out so I could get some too. And they told me about it. Don't come so early. So I remember that daycare center. That's the only one that I knew about.
Okay. Oh, what about in New York? What was the work-life situation for African-American women in New York City when you moved there?
Well, the women that I knew were able to afford. Uh, there weren't any women in my field. I was the only one. But the women that I knew that worked for the city, or they always had relatives that took care of the children. I don't know of many that had paid help, but after I got into the industry, I made enough money, and my husband had to work for the city, so we had enough income so that we could hire babysitters and housekeepers and that kind of thing. I was lucky in that respect. Now, as far as working in the industry, it was very difficult. It was very, very difficult, and if I had not had the support of my husband, I could never, never have done what I did, because there was a travel involved. I remember one night, it was a Sunday night, and after dinner, the children were in bed. I got a call. I was an editor on this film. I got a call that they wanted me to go to Detroit. At that time, I think I had 3 children. And I never would have been able, and they wanted me to get on a plane and come next day, which I couldn't do anyway. But I just want to say that I had the kind of marriage and the kind of support from my husband, and that's why I was able to be so successful in what I was doing, because he was so supportive.
How did you come to be associated with Sesame Street?
I was in the industry. I'd already had been working for 7 years at it was called NET at that time. Now it's WNET, and because I was in the union, I could get into that operation. So I had already been working at NET for about 7 years as a film editor. When Sesame Street started, I had already made a major film. And I went to a film seminar once, and one time, and this woman said that they needed someone to come and supervise their film department because it had started out small, and now it was grown and it was getting professional, and they needed expertise to run their film department. I'm a filmmaker, so I couldn't see myself as supervising other editors to edit film, but I thought, I'm going to try it. I like to try things. So I went there, and that's how I got to be the supervising film editor. This is what I made. I said, there's one stipulation. If I'm supervising your filmmakers, I also want to become one of your filmmakers. And they agreed. So I made a lot of little films for Sesame Street, which the children, your children or grandchildren, have probably seen. I made some of those films while supervising the other 2 filmmakers that were there.
What was your favorite film that you made for Sesame Street?
My favorite film for Sesame Street was Never Shown. Remember, they used to do a profile of people in your neighborhood. And I profiled an African American man who was a shoemaker. And it was a lovely little film. The curriculum people looked at it, and they decided because this man was black and he had a hammer that some of their target audiences might see him as a dangerous character. And so they never showed that film. But I didn't give up trying to profile other ethnically diverse people. I also made a film, which they did show, of a little Asian girl, and there was the curriculum was me. How do you teach children me? Well, when they showed that film to the curriculum people, they said there might be some confusion about me because she doesn't look like all of the children in our target audience. Now, just remember this. Sesame Street was funded by the Ford Foundation. The mission was to teach inner city children how to learn how to read and distinguish other things that children learn. But as it happens with a lot of projects that are funded for our use, the broader target has to be satisfied in order for the funding to survive. I've worked on several projects that happened to. So the curriculum people were very aware of funding. And they knew that if they targeted it too closely to the target audience, it would not be as popular. And they were correct. But the only thing, my criticism was, don't forget what your origins are. Include everybody, yes, but don't forget who you're being funded for.
Folks, it's 12 o'clock.
You need to ask her about, so she repeats about Bowie.
Oh, Crispus Attucks. You went to the Crispus Attucks Community Center. What was the name of the woman who influenced you greatly there?
Mrs. Boheat. She taught me etiquette. She taught me how to dress properly, good manners. She taught me, in her estimation, how to be a lady.
Did you learn anything about African American history at the Crispus Attucks?
I did. I was inspired by, when I grew up, there was Black History Week. There was 1 week that was dedicated to Black History Project. And I learned about George Washington Carver. I learned about Harriet Tubman. I learned all of the slave history. My only objections to what I learned stopped. It didn't deal with current. What were we doing currently? And that was my goal, was yes, we were slaves. Yes, there were some great people who were slaves, but we're more than just slaves. Now we're halfway free, and we're doing things that not only benefit our community, but we're doing things that benefit the nation. Benjamin Banneker. I wanted people to know that. And that was my goal in making films. Now, I saw, when I made Integration Report 1, I was interested in bringing people a message. Like, look, brothers and sisters, this is what we're doing now. This is how we work toward freedom. And in the film, not only African Americans, but there's reference to what was going on in Africa. Tom Mboya from Kenya, they were also starting for independence at that time. And then there was references to the first March on Washington with Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph. In my film, there's reference. They're not in the film, but there's reference to what they were doing. You know, Martin Luther King was young at that time, and he had just finished the Montgomery bus boycott. But there was something previous before Martin Luther King.
What are you doing currently? You have a production company?
What I'm doing currently is very exciting. I am fortunate. I'm so fortunate that what is happening today is still relevant, has still relevancy for what is happening today. We're still in the struggle, and we're still in the same struggle. And people are so amazed that I made this film 58 years ago, and we're still in that same struggle against police brutality, for better housing, for better education. We're still in that same struggle. And people are amazed that there's someone that old as I am that knows that and made a film about it. As a matter of fact, in November, I've been invited to come to California, Berkeley, and they are going to have a seminar about I don't know particularly what the focus is, but my work has been included in that, and they invited me to come. So that's what I do these days. I go and show my films and talk about them to scholars, to filmmakers, to students. I have a granddaughter who is, she's 11 years old now. She knows about my work. She knows about my films. And she's always mentioning to her teachers, my grandma was a filmmaker. So when she was in second grade, I took one of my films, and you would be amazed that the children understand those films, second graders. It just shows you what the media has done in terms of teaching children to be involved in what's going on in the world. And I go show these films, and they understand them. They ask questions about it, intelligent questions about them. So that's what I do today. I go to seminar. I'm invited to seminars and film festivals, and I show my films.
Excellent. So, anything else?
Mrs. Anderson, just quickly, do you think there'll be an integration report 2?
You're gonna make a sequel to your film?
Oh, when I was at Lincoln Center in 2015, last year, there was a series there about, I guess, the struggle, the civil rights movement, and what was going on in general with independent black filmmakers from 1983 to present. And so they gave me an evening to show my films. I have a grandson who majored in communications, and he graduated from college just recently. And so that question was asked, and I said, I don't really know if I could be physically able to do that. And my grandson stood up and said, I'm going to make integration report 2. Yeah, but yes, I would like to, as a matter of fact, I've started a book about my life. And it's going very slowly because I'm always getting involved in something else, just when I get at a good part. But I decided that since I've given so many interviews over the years, what would be an exciting project would be to get a copy of all those interviews and make a film from it. And so I'm sort of thinking of doing that. I'm not sure I'm going to do it, but I'm thinking of doing that. As far as making integration report, we need an integration report too. We do. We need to know where we've been, where we're going, and how we think we're going to get there together.
Thank you very much.
What do you think about Sesame Street today? They just replaced all their.
Gerald, the reporter is here.
Oh,
So we-
Sesame Street today has changed very much since HBO took it over. So I looked at there was a big news story that HBO was going to not fire, but just ask them to leave Bill McGrath and Bob McGrath, I'm sorry, and Luis and Gordon. Frankly, I thought that was a good thing because these characters were there when I was there, and I'm 89. I'm going to be 89 in a couple. So the old characters are there for the benefit of the parents, not the kids who are looking at it today. So I think that I don't know what the new changes are going to be, but I think it's time for a change for the children who know so much about media these days. My granddaughter is amazing, and I'm sure she is not unusual about what children her age know these days about media.
listen. I just wanted one other question to ask you. What black film today is your favorite? Who's your favorite director? What film? Is it The Color Purple? Is it Amistad? Is it which one of those films is, you're in that industry, what film do you think was the best?
I don't think I would be the best critic because people are not making documentaries about the civil rights movement. I think some very good films are being made today. I thought that Selma was a good attempt. Although I think Spike Lee has made some good films, but largely not understood by his target audience. I think they're all making great contributions, but I don't have really a favorite because I don't think we've been given enough opportunity to do the kind of films that we really want to do. You have to do projects that you can get money to do, and that's a difficulty because you can't always. I was lucky. I was able to do a film that I wanted to do that satisfied what I was trying to do. When I made Integration Report 1 and I showed it to many audiences, African American audiences, sometimes it was criticized. They said, well, this is really not a film because it's a documentary film. People don't really distinguish between how a documentary is made as opposed to other films. And so documentaries are accepted these days, and people like documentaries. But at the time I was making films, documentary meant people sitting on camera talking. And people are not, that's not that interesting to just see people talking on film. But not good documentaries are being made today, and I think some of them are good.
They want us to end it up. Would you just say something about?
She's talking to you guys over there and
I'm
not
sorry.
where.
Look at George.
Oh, look at,
Just
I'm sorry.
Your opportunity to get back here to Lancaster and talk to people. That's and end it with that. How happy you are to be back here in Lancaster.
to be part of this project?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, I feel honored.
Would you say in the complete
I
sentence?
really feel honored to be participating in discovering our treasures. When I got the communication from Mrs. Ford, I was bowled over because hardly anybody in Lancaster knows about my career. So I was really pleased and excited for the people in Lancaster to know what my accomplishments were. So I thank you for inviting me.
Hey, Rich.